Hello and welcome to our Old Testament survey lesson on Ezra-Nehemiah. Now, why do I have these hyphenated and not conjoined with an and or an ampersand? Well, because in the original Hebrew Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah was one book, book of Ezra-Nehemiah. And when the Old Testament was translated into Greek in what we call the Septuagint, those two books were separated. And that has continued on to this day. Same content, but originally one book, and we're going to treat it kind of like that in this lesson. Okay, so let's dive in. All right, first a couple of dates, not because you necessarily have to have these memorized, but just to give you an idea of how much history is spanned by this book of Ezra and Nehemiah. So this is going to be our post-exilic timeline. Post-exilic, of course, meaning after the exile. Okay, so there are a series of returns from exile in what was originally Babylon and then became Persia when the Babylonian Empire fell, back to the Promised Land, back to primarily Jerusalem. And in Hebrew, these returns are called Aliyah. So the first of these happens in 538 BC. As a little reminder, Jerusalem fell in the year 586 BC to Nebuchadnezzar. And that's when the southern kingdom of Judah came to an end. So from 586 to 538 was the exile, and then in 538 we have the first wave of returns, and that's led by a guy named Zerubbabel, who besides having a very odd name, actually means born in Babylon. Zerub meaning seed or offspring, which is interesting, right? That's a very important word in the Old Testament, and Babel being the same root as Babylon, Tower of Babel, etc. He is the heir of David, but he's very much not a king at this point. We'll talk more about that in a few slides. From 520 to 516, so a few decades after that first return, the Israelites worked on rebuilding their temple, and there were some different things that happened with that. You can reference the prophetic book of Haggai for more details on that, and we'll cover that later in class when we get to the book of Haggai. But that's when the temple is rebuilt. And then later, almost 100 years, I guess 80 years after the first return, we have a second return, and this is led by Ezra. So this is very important. The first return is described in the book of what we have in our English Bible of Ezra, chapters 1 through 6. Ezra himself is not even alive at this point. Ezra shows up in chapter 7 of the book of Ezra and continues through the book of Nehemiah, right? Which, again, remember, this is one book in the original Hebrew. So Ezra leads the second return, and it's been 80 years, so it's not like all of this is happening within one decade. And then in 444 BC, give or take, Nehemiah enters the scene. He returns to Jerusalem to rebuild Jerusalem's walls, and he and Ezra knew each other. Which is an interesting fact, but Nehemiah acts as governor. Okay, one way to kind of keep some of this straight and would be to think of the book. If you think of it in our English division, the book of Ezra, which remember starts before Ezra comes along, focuses on rebuilding the temple. The book of Nehemiah, and again, remember, these were originally one book in the Hebrew, focuses on rebuilding Jerusalem's walls. Okay, but we'll talk more in detail on that moving forward. Okay, so let's, if you got your Bible, this would be a great time to open it, and to open to the book of 2 Chronicles, the very end of the book, the last two verses of the book. And I just want to make some comments. As you do that, notice that if you look at the next page, right after 2 Chronicles is the book of Ezra, and compare how Chronicles ends and how Ezra begins. And you'll notice it's the same event linking these two books together. We might call this the Edict or the Decree of Cyrus. And I'm just going to read this and make a few comments. So in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord, that's a very important phrase whenever it occurs, the word of the Lord, the word of Yahweh, by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord, Yahweh, stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may the Lord, Yahweh, his God, be with him. Let him go up. And you might remember from when we looked at Chronicles, that's kind of left hanging. That's the end of the book. It's actually the last book in the Hebrew Bible, based on their order, leaving you the sense of, is that it? Let him go up and do what? And in a sense, Ezra and Nehemiah answer what they go up and do, but in another sense, Ezra and Nehemiah, as we'll see, leave the story hanging. Okay, but notice a couple of things here. The word of the Lord, the mouth of Jeremiah. Who is it who's responsible for this decree? The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that, okay? So this is not the writer of Chronicles, which, interestingly enough, many have proposed Ezra as a candidate for that, is not at all shy about saying that God is behind this. This is not something that Cyrus just thought up. And notice how interesting it is that Cyrus, throughout his decree, mentions Yahweh's name, right? Doesn't necessarily mean that Cyrus is what we would think of as a believer, one of God's people, but at least he's maybe the most powerful king in the world at that point. He's giving lip service to the one true God. So I think that's pretty cool. Okay, let's unpack this a little bit more. So the word of Jeremiah, what is this talking about? Well, Jeremiah had actually predicted hundreds of years earlier that the exile would be 70 years. Now, there's some debate as to when exactly that's meant to start and when that's meant to end. Does that start from the final fall of Jerusalem and not end until the temple is rebuilt? Does that start from the first wave of exiles from Jerusalem in 605 and then go to Cyrus's decree and when the people return? Is 70 meant to be a nice round number, 7 tens? And I don't think we necessarily need to get into that at this point. But regardless of how God dates this, it's about 70 years of captivity. And interestingly enough, if you were to flip over, and you don't have to do this, but just if you were to flip over to, I believe it's Daniel 9, you would find that Daniel, while he is in Babylon, is reading the prophet Jeremiah, and he reads, oh, the exile is going to be 70 years. It's been about 70 years. And he prays, and God gives him a response that unpacks that 70 years and says, in a sense, well, the people haven't fully repented, so there's going to be 70 times 7. And that gets into one of the most interesting prophecies in the entirety of the Old Testament, which may be pointing to the specific year in which Jesus would show up and make an end to sin. Anyhow, we don't have time to go into that right now, but I commend to you a look at Daniel chapter 9 if you're interested in that. Okay. Isaiah also predicted this. It's not just Jeremiah. In fact, if you were to look at Isaiah 44, the end of that chapter and the beginning of chapter 45, God actually names Cyrus. He says, I say of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he will fulfill my purpose. He will say of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and of the temple your foundation shall be laid. Thus says Yahweh to his anointed. That's the Hebrew word for Messiah, very interesting, one who has been chosen for a specific task. And he says, Cyrus, I've laid the groundwork for you, and you're the one who's going to let my people go back and rebuild the temple. Well, that's fascinating, because Isaiah is making these predictions. We'll just take a round number here, around circa the year 700 BC. Okay, Cyrus is making his decree in 538 BC, and Isaiah is predicting him by name. Okay, again, skeptical scholars will look at this and say, well, there's no way that part of Isaiah could have been written before Cyrus came around, because obviously people don't know that. But we're talking about a God who spoke everything into existence. foretelling 150 years into the future is small potatoes compared to that. And we mentioned this before, but Yahweh stirred up the spirit of Cyrus. This is repeated in the book of Ezra for emphasis. This is not just Cyrus becomes king, conquers Babylon, and decides, you know what, how could I get people to like me? I'll let them return home. Now, there may be some of that going on in the mind of Cyrus, but the idea that the people should go back and rebuild the temple, and in fact, Cyrus ends up funding this and even returning all of the treasures of the temple that Nebuchadnezzar had stolen. This originates with God. God is the one who is orchestrating history here as the sovereign ruler. Now, how does that work with Cyrus's freedom? That'd be a fascinating discussion, but not one that we're going to focus on at this time. But suffice it to say, God stirs up Cyrus to fulfill his prophetic word that he has spoken hundreds of years before, and the people are allowed to go back. Okay, so the first wave is under Zerubbabel. He's the heir of David. It's a group of about 42,000 from the tribes of Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. Those are the tribes that inhabited the southern kingdom. They go back and they lay the foundation for the temple, and this is a very important passage for our understanding of what's going on here. In Ezra 3, they lay the foundation of the temple, and they're rejoicing and they're celebrating, but there are some of the older ones who start weeping and wailing loudly, so loudly that it's hard to tell, in the sound, the text says, whether it's a happy sound or a sad sound. And these elders are wailing because they can remember seeing as young kids Solomon's temple, and this new temple they can tell from the foundation is going to be much smaller, much less glorious. And so it's a very bittersweet moment. And it's something that kind of represents what's going on in the book. Yes, it's happy. We've got a return. We've got this temple, but it's not the same. It's not nearly what it used to be. Something is missing. Now, there is some opposition, so they lay the foundation, and then the temple gets delayed. We find out in the book of Haggai, spoiler warning, that eventually the Israelites take a lot of the lumber that they'd been given to build the temple, and they decide to use it to build their own homes. And so Haggai has to tell them to go out and cut down some more trees so that they can get about prioritizing God's temple. Anyhow, we'll get into that when we get to Haggai, but finally they finish this temple, and it is much smaller than Solomon's, and God never comes back to it. And so this is kind of what's going on in the book of Ezra. It's a return. It's not quite, though, what the Israelites were hoping for. There's a key phrase in biblical studies. Maybe you've heard of this, the already and the not yet. There are some things that are already true, but there are also some things that have not yet happened. So they're already. The people have returned to the land. That's good. They are back in the land that God had promised Abraham. They've rebuilt the temple. That's good. It is good that they have God's house in their midst. David's line is intact. Zerubbabel is his heir, and Zerubbabel will continue having kids. You can read that line in Matthew when we come to the genealogy of Jesus, the great heir of David. However, it's not yet. It's bittersweet. Yeah, they're back in the land, but they're this little backwater province in the Persian Empire. They don't have their own freedom. Far from it. The temple's rebuilt, but as we mentioned before, God never comes back to this temple. In fact, the Lord never shows up personally at this temple until we read in the book of Luke that a little baby, 8 days old, was brought to the temple to be dedicated, and that baby was Jesus, God in flesh, coming to the temple finally. But in his glory, God never comes back. Remember the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel saw God's glory leave, and God took his royal war chariot out into Babylon where Ezekiel saw him, and the glory departed from the temple and doesn't come back until the time of Jesus. And David's heirs survive, but they're not kings. At best, they're governors. If we were going to kind of graph this, so to speak, used this graph before. This is from a book called God's Big Picture by Von Roberts. But imagine the y-axis here as the level of awesomeness, say that a little tongue-in-cheek. And then the x-axis here is time. Okay, so awesomeness level over time in the Old Testament, if we go post-fall in Eden, peaks with Solomon, and we might even say the high point of Solomon's reign is when he completes his first temple and God's glory fills it. And then Israel's history is all downhill from there. And the prophets speak about this glorious future, but what Israel is experiencing is down here, and there seems to be a growing gap between these two things. And Ezra-Nehemiah really explores that and typifies that. Okay, we come now to the story of Ezra himself. So Ezra is a Levite, directly descended from Aaron, the first high priest. He's described as being skilled in the law of Moses, so that's high praise. He knew the Old Testament as it was at the time very well. In fact, not only did he know it well, but his heart was in it. He had set his heart to study God's law and to do it. Okay, so he was not just sitting in his ivory tower knowing all these things but not actually practicing them. He desired to honor God and to follow him and to teach. Okay, so he was you might say, an Old Testament teacher, so to speak. And he goes on, kind of in tandem with Nehemiah, to lead a public revival. You can read about that in Nehemiah 8 through 10. He reads from the law out loud, and the people realize that they have not kept it. He prays for them, they confess their sins, and they make a covenant to rededicate themselves to obeying the law of God. So Ezra, great guy, very well learned, and I mentioned this briefly before, but many believe that he was instrumental in compiling the various books of the Old Testament together into the collection that we have today, and he is a good candidate for the author of the book of Chronicles as well. Okay, Nehemiah. So Nehemiah, we learn, is an official for the king of Persia. Years later, this is Artaxerxes. Nehemiah is very well respected and trusted. He's the cupbearer, so the king trusts him to drink the cup before the king does. So if it's poison, Nehemiah will go down. But Nehemiah is in Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire, and he hears from his brother that Jerusalem, the city, is still without walls. It's in a helpless, kind of disgraceful position, and he weeps, he mourns. He is very broken about this. Well, he fasts and he prays, and he wants to do something about it. And eventually, the king notices that he's sad and asks him, "Hey, what's up? Your face is fallen." Nehemiah prays, and he says, "Well, king, how can I be happy? The city of my fathers is lying unprotected without walls." And the king says, "Well, what would you like to do?" And Nehemiah says, "Well, I would like to go and rebuild the walls, and here's how much time it'll take, and here's what I'll need." And the king grants him his request, and Nehemiah gets to go serve as governor of Jerusalem. I think it's very interesting, two things to point out here quickly. One, Nehemiah's first response, as he mourns, is to pray and to fast. Okay, so that's the first thing he does, but it's not the only thing he does. The second thing he does is he plans. Okay, we read that the king asks him for specific details. How long will you be gone? What will you need? And Nehemiah knows. Nehemiah gives him an answer. So he's not just praying, saying, "God, why don't you do something?" He's praying and he's planning, so when God opens the door, he is immediately ready to walk through it. Now, a big theme throughout the book of Ezra-Nehemiah is opposition. And there's a lot of stuff we could say about this. I'm just going to give you a few of the highlights. So the first time we see this is actually back in Zerubbabel's time at Ezra 4. There's a group of Samaritans, so people that are part Jewish by blood and part Gentiles from the remnants of the northern kingdom. They show up and they offer to help with the temple. Zerubbabel turns them away, and in response, they shut down the project. They write to the king and say, these people are just trying to rebel. Regardless of whether these Samaritans truly wanted to help or whether they were being deceptive, you can take different viewpoints of that from the text, but the point is, these are other groups coming and having hostility with God's people. This is, again, not what the prophets envisioned. The prophets envisioned a time when the Israelites and the nations around them would all be united in their worship of God. That's clearly not happening here. Nehemiah is opposed by some Gentiles, primarily two guys named Sanballat and Tobiah, in a lot of different ways. He's threatened with attack, and so as they are rebuilding the wall, he has people guard in shifts. He has people open carry, we might say, with swords so that they can defend themselves if they are attacked. He's threatened with slander. It's a great little story in Nehemiah where Sanballat and Tobiah say, hey, we know that you're rebelling and you're just rebuilding these walls so you can declare independence from the king of Persia. So you better stop or we're going to tell him. And Nehemiah says, no, I'm not. You just made that up. And just continues about his business. And then they try to get Nehemiah to sin. They pay somebody off to try to convince Nehemiah to go hide in the inner room of the temple, which would reveal him to be a coward and one who doesn't respect the house of God. And Nehemiah sees through it and resists, and they are unable to take him down. So he is a leader with a lot of integrity, and it shows. But he's ultimately successful, and he resists each challenge, and within 52 days, the bulk of the wall is completed, and he has done exactly what he set out to do. So if you want to read about these more specifically, and it is something I would highly recommend, Nehemiah chapters 4 through 6. Is where you would find it. Okay, so what's the point? We've hit just a few of the highlights from these books. We've covered a little bit of the history. This is actually, in terms of chronology, about the last of the stories we get in the Old Testament. This takes us almost up to the year 400 BC, which is roughly where the events of the Old Testament end. And we'll talk later this week about what happened in between the Old and the New Testaments. But here's the big theme. Here's the big takeaway. This idea of already versus not yet. Okay? The Israelites are back in the land. Good. It's not fully what they had in mind, right? They were expecting a glorious kingdom, and they hadn't had that. This helps us understand why they were so eager for a military leader when Jesus eventually showed up. Their temple is rebuilt, but God never returns to it. And so, yeah, they're God's people, but yeah, they're making sacrifices, but God's not dwelling in their midst. And in fact, God doesn't come to dwell in their midst until he comes in flesh as the person of Jesus Christ, God the Son, at the start of the New Testament. And David's heirs survive and continue to survive, but they're not kings. Okay? So what does this have to tell us? It tells us that the people at the end of the Old Testament were longing for something better. They had tasted a little bit of good fortune, but they knew that this is not all that God had promised. And they realized that. They were expecting more. And so we might say that this whole story just cries out for something better, or as we know, someone better. Jesus Christ, who does come and does fulfill all of the great things that the prophets have talked about. And that's why it should be really exciting to us when we turn to the book of Matthew, first book of the New Testament in our order, and we read chapter 1, verse 1, and we read, this is the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, Christ being the Greek word for Messiah, Jesus the chosen one, Jesus the anointed one, Jesus the son of David, the son of Abraham. And then we get the genealogy, which is not just a list of stuffy old names, but God has kept his promise. The time has come, the time has arrived. All these hopes and fears of all the years, we might say to steal from the Christmas hymn, are met in Bethlehem on that night when Jesus shows up. And I think that's pretty cool. But for the purposes of reading Ezra-Nehemiah, maybe we can relate to the Israelites longing for something more. We're in a better situation. Jesus has come, but Jesus hasn't come back yet. And so we still see the brokenness in the world. We still see that there's more yet to happen when Jesus returns and makes all things new. And so maybe we can feel a little bit what they were feeling, that yes, good has happened, and for us even better, but there's still more. And one day it's coming, and one day the glorious kingdom of God will fill the world, and the whole world will be God's temple, and we will reign with Christ as fellow heirs into eternity forever and ever. Amen. And I think that's an encouraging thought.